back. So we're going to talk about what a task is not, first of all, just to define our terms. So pre-selected language, we're talking about task repetition, of course, in this segment. So pre-selected language items that are practiced for their own sake, for instance, gap fill exercises, multiple choice questions, and pronunciation drills. These are not tasks, these are exercises or activities. So what is a task? Well, a task is a classroom activity whose focus is on communicating meaning. This is a quote from Scott Thornberry, of course, and it includes such things as information gap activities, classroom mingles, and debates. So to continue, let's talk about repetition. So getting learners to repeat the same task, but with different parameters, results in a richer degree of accuracy and grammatical complexity. And this is from doing task-based teaching. And of course, I think anybody who uses task repetition in their lessons would agree that that's true. But why repeat tasks? If you consider the learner, for instance, a learner who's been asked to narrate a picture story or describe what they've seen in a short video segment, they have a lot of challenges. There is the challenge of recall. There's focusing on what they want to say, selecting appropriate information, producing relevant utterances, and all while monitoring the adequacy and accuracy in the discourse in conversation with another partner. This is quite a cognitive load for someone in a second language, so task repetition aims to mitigate these issues. So, what improvements can we expect? Well, there will be improvements in fluency, so shorter pauses and more words per minute. False starts and self-corrections will be minimized. There will be fewer errors on the repeats and a greater range of vocabulary and syntactic complexity. So anybody, I mean, I've seen it in my own teaching and anecdotally from other teachers that I know, they all say that you can find these improvements in task repetition, but there is evidence to back this up. Now, I've chosen a very short segment, of Martin Bygate's study, which I'll give you a link to in the suggested reading at the end, but there have been many more studies studying what happens with task repetition. This particular study focused on one learner who had to narrate a Tom and Jerry cartoon segment and then repeat the task. The repetition was 3 days after the initial task. So if you look at the study in the book, there'll be the chapter at the end on the last slide. There are many, many more parameters than this, but so I've just selected a few for the sake of time in the presentation. If we just go back there. Okay, grammatical complexity. So these are instances of grammatical structures attempted. In the first run through, we have a score of 4. And on the repeat, 3 days later, 7. So we've got a 75% increase already in grammatical complexity in the student's performance. Lexical repertoire, which can be adverbial or adjectival modification of noun phrases, or can be evaluative comments, adverbials, luckily, unfortunately, that kind of thing. There is again quite an increase. Disfluencies are down, so with that could be false starts, pauses, exact verbatim repetition of what they've just said. There's quite a decrease there. Looking at the errors, again, they're down. So they go from 9.4% of the speaker's output down to 8.2. So it's not a huge decrease, but it's certainly significant. And looking at cohesion, so with subordinated clauses, the first time, well, we have a ratio. The second number is 28. This is the sentences uttered by the student. And the first number, number 7, this will be subordinated clauses with appropriate and accurate linkers. You see that there are 7 subordinated clauses to 28 sentences. On the repeat 3 days later, well, we have 26, so 2 fewer than the original 28 sentences. This time we have 12 subordinated clauses. So this is a very big difference, and it demonstrates that through task repetition, the learner is performing at a higher level of competence. Okay. So how can we use this in our own teaching? Well, here's a coursebook example from an intermediate coursebook for adult students that we use here. I'm not including a screenshot for copyright reasons, but I'll talk you through it. It starts with a picture, which establishes the topic of meeting new people. We go from that into listening with gist questions and listening comprehension questions, so quite a product approach to this lesson. Then we have vocabulary embedded in the listening extract with multiple choice questions and gap fill. Grammar, again, auxiliary verbs in question form from the extract with multiple choice and gap fill. Then we move on to pronunciation with looking at the weak forms of auxiliary forms. So we've done quite a lot of exercises to practice these things. Then we move on to developing conversation through asking follow-up questions, a vital skill to improve students' fluency and a very good part of this lesson, I might add. And finally, we have the conversation practice where the students get to use some of this themselves. Now, you probably recognize this is a present, practice, produce structure of a lesson. How can we improve it? Well, we can incorporate task repetition and we can bookend this lesson with conversation practice. So start from the very beginning with conversation. I'll show you what I mean in the next slide. So we still use our coursebook picture to introduce the topic, but this time, instead of going straight for the listening, we will elicit the typical questions that students ask when meeting new people. Now, students are experts at this already in their language one, and by this level, they'll be familiar with some of the question forms for these first meetings. They've already practiced it to some degree. So after this, we will deal with any accuracy errors, potentially through eliciting the correct versions or supplying them ourselves, if need be. Now, planning time, I'm sure that Sandy's next presentation is going to talk about this in more detail, but there's a similar study, which there is also a reference in my last slide to the study just mentioned, where planning time, students who have it, they perform at a much higher level than students who don't. So it's crucial to give them some. I'm sure Sandy's going to talk to you more about that. We go into pair work where students have the conversation and then we can mix the pairs up again and they can repeat it. So we've got a little bit of task repetition there. Through our feedback section, we will check the students' performance, deal with emergent language, going back to Elsbeta Hudoba's presentation there. Very important, and it personalizes it for the students, and also error correction. So our new lesson plan has gone from a present, practice, produce kind of lesson to more of a test, teach, test. We have a conversation practice at the beginning. We've taken emergent language from the students, which is very important to personalize it for them. Then we've gone to our listening, gist questions, comprehension questions. Excellent, very important. Now, when it comes to the vocabulary, this can be minimized to an extent because we have emergent language from the students, which is much more important. And the grammar, well, we've probably sorted out the problems with the form in the initial conversation feedback and elicitation. So we can give them the gap fills and the error and the multiple choice questions as homework. Pronunciation we can do. Developing conversation through follow-up questions is vital because this will help them to improve at a higher level. And then we go to the conversation practice. So the lesson has been bookended, and the students, after the initial practice and the listening, the better model, they then get to incorporate some of these ideas and perform at that high level. Our advantages of building a lesson in this way is we're building on the students' prior language knowledge. So by the time they get to the listening, they are much more engaged because they've already performed the task. They get to notice the gap between their competence and that of the other speakers. It's personalized from the beginning. Students are fully engaged by the time they get to the listening task. Planning time and task repetitions enable students to perform at a higher level of competence. And very importantly for second language acquisition, students' free production is enhanced by at least 50%, which is vital and probably the best thing about structuring the lesson in this way. And of course, you can then repeat the task a few days later with different parameters, as Jane Willis said earlier, using perhaps less time to perform the task and recording the task, that kind of thing. Finally, here's the promised reading list. There are 4 books here. A framework for task-based learning is the classic. This isn't task-based learning. What I've shown you per se, it incorporates some elements. But if you want to know more about task-based learning, start with this book, Doing Task-Based Teaching by Dave Willis and Jane Willis. And the studies I've quoted can be found in Challenge and Change and Language Teaching in much more detail, going into all the parameters and telling you the transcripts and everything are in there. Chapters 12 and 13 in particular have informed this slide presentation. I'm Phil James, and thank you very much for listening. And